Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. Welcome to another episode of the Market Access Podcast. Today with Anne Loos from Wickenstones. Whoever doesn't know Annie yet, I would suggest that Annie, you could introduce yourself just a bit, I think, and then we can jump into the key discussion today, which is especially around market access reimbursement in the US and latest kind of changes and developments in that area.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Stefan, for inviting me to join today. As he said, my name is Anne Loos. I'm the technical lead for global HTA with Wickenstones, where I've been now for about 4 years. So I've actually been in buy-in access strategy for over a decade, where I started my career with the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, also known as ICER, here in the US. So that really kind of jump-started my now role as global lead in HTA. So yeah, that's kind of the background and where I came from, and looking forward to the conversation.
Very good. Perfect. So I think that gives us already kind of quite nice frame. I mean, you are knowing the healthcare system in the US from different perspectives. So, I mean, if you could maybe give us, to start here as well a bit, the kind of key maybe major changes, challenges, and adaptation maybe as well in the US healthcare system, of course, with respect to market access and reimbursement in the last year. So not only focusing maybe on the last, let's say, 6 months, but just to get a bit of an understanding for whoever is maybe not an expert in terms of the US reimbursement.
Yeah, sure. So when I started my career with ICER, as I mentioned, that was actually in 2014. So they were still quite a small organization, didn't have quite the notoriety that they have today. But when I started my career, back when it was just getting its feet off the ground, the US, just given the evolution the last decade or so, the market access environment has really shifted quite dramatically. One of the key drivers, I think, of that has been legislation, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which has now really altered how manufacturers are thinking about both pricing and evidence requirements. And at the same time, there's a movement towards global harmonization of assessments, particularly with the EU JCA, or the Joint Clinical Assessment, which has indirectly, in a lot of ways, influenced US payer expectations, really forcing companies to think beyond just the US and local requirements. What this has meant in practice, just given the uncertainty and ever-changing environment, that the industry finds itself more frequently on the defensive, just in anticipation of potential tighter scrutiny, while also trying to adapt to this increasingly complex reimbursement landscape. So all these changes have created significant challenges, really disrupting the existing system and adding an additional layer of unpredictability.
So I was just doing a quick kind of action. I think the uncertainty maybe also linked to what I think you said as well at the beginning of your statement, where maybe a bit of a bigger focus would also need to be taken outside of the US, which might also have a potential impact into the US, right? I mean, that was probably true not only the last couple of few months, but also, let's say, before that. Could you maybe just come up with a a key example before maybe the new administration has been put into place, just that we can get as well a bit of a feeling where maybe as well uncertainty as well arise?
Yeah, I mean, I think another key example is with the most favored nation. I mean, obviously, there's still, even in itself, has a lot of uncertainties embedded in it. But I think all in all, that is still kind of pushing the narrative. So with the most favored nation proposals and broader policy debates, I think the U.S. manufacturers in particular are beginning to think about more European style thinking. Considering not just FDA approval, but also how the data will resonate with groups like ICER, but also even, cross-national frameworks. So the challenge is really about balancing that innovation that's required to tailor the evidence more dynamically, but also the higher cost of doing so.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the interesting thing would for sure be to see if those kind of evidence requirements would potentially, let's say, get a bit closer. I think in medical device areas, I think we see that a bit, where also I think the US FDA is a bit more stricter, for example, in terms of requesting RCTs as well. Whereas there at that, or let's say with that kind of direction, I think the European level is a bit more, maybe still call it a bit more relaxed. We need to see how that might as well evolve. But I think for drugs, that might as well be maybe an interesting kind of area. I mean, you just brought in MFN. And I mean, most people are rather thinking about pricing and the price impact with MFN. Where do you see the direct link? And I know where you're getting from or where it's coming from. Where do you see the direct link to the evidence generation, especially when thinking about MFN?
Well, the U.S. market, it just will likely never have the same level of centralization as Europe.
Yeah.
Culturally and politically, there's this deep resistance to the idea of having a single national organization dictating value and access. But there are clear signs of movement in that direction. Basically, it's creating these new levers, I think, for government-led negotiation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think overall they're starting to think more broadly about evidence and also earlier, much earlier than they used to. And I've seen that just, in my time since ICER, when it really wasn't on anyone's agenda, frankly, to be doing kind of iterative, things like payer interviews and really understanding stakeholder perspectives before they actually start generating evidence. So like really moving beyond this one-time static assessments, which are often too late, done too late, and aren't really end up being that meaningful for payers. With the U.S. assessment specifically, obviously, it's still very payer-specific and highly fragmented. But again, there are those signs of convergence with European-style assessment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the key points I normally have as well in mind when thinking about the US is basically innovation. Of course, we all know that, say, bringing innovation into a system, which is a bit more, let's say, clearly regulated, let's maybe call it like that. Do you see any kind of way how innovation could be potentially be included, especially when we're thinking about, let's say, how US payers, organizations like ICER, you just mentioned as well, approach value assessment, and how could that potentially maybe even be tailored towards different stakeholders and also being assessed there and maybe even integrated more dynamically? Do you see any kind of, let's say, movement from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely room for innovation. I think there always is. And increasingly manufacturers are recognized as I mentioned, they're recognizing the value of that iterative earlier evidence generation. But AI, I think, also offers the chance to accelerate and simplify potentially evidence generation, freeing up us human experts to focus on, more strategy and interpretation. So it can help address those kind of persistent pain points in market access, especially, time-consuming literature reviews, inconsistent methodologies, and tailoring to all these different types of stakeholders. And at the same time, I think, there's some challenges there, though, too, where over-reliance could potentially reduce the depth of, critical human oversight. And just given that market access is so nuanced, future systems may require less human intervention, but you can't really completely remove that expert altogether. Or that would just increase the risk of, errors, misalignment, and the credibility of the insights.
Yeah, I know. I can only agree with that. I think there's always, the need for, at least at this point in time, I would say, the need for, expert involvement. I think whether it's credibility, validity, or whatever, I think you can maybe take from there. I mean, now we have seen as well a couple of, weeks or months ago that the FDA was also moving a bit into a direction to bring maybe AI, at least from a regulatory perspective, into the more focus. I think they have announced the so-called ELSA initiatives, where they as well, include an AI in order to get their, maybe name it a bit more broadly, but to get their kind of process a bit more streamlined. I think details, at least I'm not a regulatory expert, are not 100% clear, but they said and they claim that they use AI in order to, optimize their internal decision-making process for the submission by the companies. Moving a bit from regulatory away, I just want to take that a bit of an anchor, of course. From your perspective, could a validated, and that's, I think, the important thing, a validated AI system become potentially a credible part of future evidence submissions? Maybe differentiate that as well a bit between negotiations, payer negotiations, maybe in the US, but also beyond. And then also the technology assessment, whether this is a strict HTA, as we know that from European countries and, for example, from Canada, but maybe also when, for example, US payers would assess the value of a product. Would you think this would be something, important, useful, and how could that maybe as well be implemented in such a market like the US?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just given, like we have already talked about, the US payer system is likely to remain highly fragmented. But this is where AI could potentially be valuable. So mainly around consolidating and synthesizing large volumes of information, and be able to tailor that to specific audience. But I think over time, as AI systems become more validated and more transparent, they could possibly contribute to things like, evidence packages, and things like that. But looking ahead, there is also clear potential for HTA bodies in Europe to benefit from AI-supported evidence synthesis as well. And the European system is already moving towards joint assessments, as we know with the JCA. So the use case is arguably more straightforward there. Whereas in the US, AI's utility may lie mostly in cutting through that fragmentation.
Yeah, of course. I think, you could even see that in different perspective, right? I mean, the more fragmented the market is, maybe the more AI can, of course, help, as you as well just said. I mean, on the other hand, you could as well just say, look, the more structured a system is and the more, the regulation is given, the more AI can also be, even more efficient, right? I mean, it has probably two different kind of components, but ultimately, I think the question is still, I guess, how fast maybe payers might as well utilize AI for themselves as well. I mean, we have talked a lot about, application of AI for pharmaceutical companies and the benefits for that. But I mean, how would and could potentially payers as well utilize that? I mean, what are the maybe even biggest kind of opportunities, maybe as well from a payer's perspective? I mean, utilizing just AI for their work, in comparison to maybe as well the way pharma companies can utilize. I think you brought up already a couple of different things from a pharmacy perspective, but maybe as well from a payer's perspective. Any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so I think payers and policymakers have both acknowledged that, there's a potential with AI, but there's a lot of conversation around how to actually validate it. Mm-hmm. So again, goes back to that need for an expert. To gain trust, though, I think companies would need to kind of show transparency around how AI is deriving inputs and, what sources were included, if there were any biases that were mitigated, and how reproducibility can be ensured, because that's what's that's how we operate in science, right? And this isn't entirely new. I mean, transparency and reporting and publication has long been a challenge, with ongoing debates about open science versus commercial confidentiality. So the difference now is that AI introduces this additional layer of complexity around the issue of transparency. So for payers, confidence will need to come from clear frameworks, things like independent auditing and just, overall demonstrating overall safeguards for how this is being used and interpreted. So they will expect same or even greater levels of rigor, frankly, and accountability that apply to more traditional evidence submissions before they even consider AI-derived outputs credible enough to inform those real decisions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, if we just turn that a bit, let's say on the other side, again, getting back to the pharmaceutical side, let's say, of course, trust, transparency, reproducibility, I think that's also, let's say, maybe call it the buzzwords, what also pharma companies are, of course, requesting, because ultimately they are driven by the payers, as you have as well just said. But the question is, let's say also, how could that maybe strengthen and maybe make the lives and the business deliverables by the pharmaceutical companies even more efficient? You have as well have just touched base on the European JCA, where the timelines are really crisp and quite, let's say, tense as well, especially, let's say, towards the kind of submission. Where would you see there maybe the kind of benefits of AI? Where are there any? Sometimes we still have the kind of issue, not so much on the transparency side. I think that's maybe kind of given point with the probabilities those language models are doing, but also on the reproducibility, for example. Is there a way that we could already utilize and use AI now, or would you rather still say, let's keep an eye on it? And of course, we can use maybe some parts, but I think it's still a way to go, especially maybe taking the current use cases in our day-to-day work.
Yeah, it's definitely a way to go. It's not going to go away now, right? Just, it's going to be a work in progress, I think, for a long time. How long, I think, is a big question, but it's going to be, iterative. Like we're going to have to really have lots of conversations about how to make sure that what we're producing is credible and validated, eliminating the bias wherever we can. But being able to get to that point, you need to actually use the systems to, kind of teach you how to understand those more nuanced aspects of market access. So it's still a lot of work, I think, that needs to be done here. But I think a lot of people are recognizing the potential and are dedicated to making sure that it gets to that point. It's just the society we live in. We want to do more with less all the time. So I think it's definitely moving in that direction.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think another point what I hear a lot, probably also from, let's say, both sides, payers as well as the pharmaceutical company side, is that maybe, let's say, dynamic kind of pricing or pricing models maybe rather might potentially also be a way forward. We can probably still remember the pay for performance, let's say, endeavors a couple of years ago, especially, let's say, across Europe. Is that maybe as well a way, especially maybe potentially to analyze real world evidence data, claims data a bit more dynamically, where AI can help us as well, more getting maybe as well into further flexible pricing models into the future?
Yeah, there's definitely potential. I think a lot of what companies are looking into now are using AI for real world evidence. Just again, going back to being able to synthesize evidence. But again, you have to kind of work within the confines of the AI system and really kind of train it to be thinking about those aspects, because at most right now, it's just more surface level, insights and takeaways that we can use from it. But as you do more of it, again, it's gonna learn how to actually be thinking about the real world evidence and potentially other ways that we could use evidence in our discussions.
Yeah, Yeah, no, I agree. Moving again a bit back, maybe to the US, and again, I think the kind of podcast and the episodes is rather as well a bit broader than just discussing, let's say, very actual kind of, discussions. But I mean, how do you maybe see the US healthcare system, especially from market access reimbursement perspective, in maybe the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years time, knowing, of course, that there might be different elections, et cetera. But just, let's say, generally, how and where would you see the market we're acting in changing in those kind of, let's say, timeframes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, it's definitely going to be pushing the envelope in towards less fragmentation. I think we've all acknowledged that the way things are just don't work. And we're trying all these different potential solutions like the IRA. That's likely to continue to reshape drug pricing dynamics, particularly as Medicare negotiations expand to cover more products. And private payers are going to be taking cues from these negotiations. So there's going to be this ripple effect across the system. And at the same time, ICER's influence as a benchmark for value assessment is not stopping, right? It's continuing to grow, which is pushing manufacturers to engage earlier and more iteratively on the evidence. So there will be a stronger pressure to demonstrate real value through things like, the broader use of RWE and also possibly AI-enabled evidence synthesis. But that said, again, there's still this cultural and political resistance. So it's possible we're going to see a patchwork of policies and payer practices. But that will, of course, then inch closer to that standardization, but without ever fully consolidating, I don't think.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, you touched basically a couple of times on those cultural differences, and I fully agree. I think fundamentally, I think the way the systems are just being handled, and also I think the way I think it's being also thought about, those kind of markets, I think are quite crucial. If we just take the, let's say, simple parts like the US versus Europe, turn that a bit into a positive mode. I mean, what are the kind of learnings Americans take from Europe, and of course as well the other way around? What could maybe Europeans, if you take all of those different markets as one group, of course, what could they learn from the US? I think just towards maybe ending a bit the kind of podcast discussion. I mean, what are those kind of two buckets you would basically give in either direction?
Well, there's of course the early evidence planning that we've been talking about, but also just greater alignment. So, I mean, looking at the JCA, U.S. stakeholders can see how this move towards standardization can be supported by things potentially like things like AI, but also just generally streamlining that payer engagement and reducing that administrative duplication that is very time consuming and costly, of course. I think there's also a greater appreciation of transparency and stakeholder engagement, which European HTAs have emphasized for years, with very clear frameworks. I think U.S. payers are not bound by the same processes, but manufacturers are increasingly realizing that greater transparency and communication can help build that trust and strengthen the value arguments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. No, perfect. I think, Annie, that was good fun. I think good insights into the US system, into some of the key components as well of the future, taking AI, real-world evidence, JCA, MFN. We also touched base just very briefly. That was, I think, great insights. Thanks a lot for your time, and looking forward to see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Interesting insights by Anne Loos, not only on the US itself, but also on the relation between Europe and the US, but also on the current kind of indicative areas like MFN, which you also touched base at the beginning. I think key is also, let's say, when introducing MFN, but also other kind of examples. It increases uncertainties, and uncertainties are, of course, let's say, not only having, let's say, kind of potential negative impact, especially from a business perspective, but it might also increase the further look up for additional agreement and maybe relationships between each other. So I think the US can learn from Europe. Europe can learn from the US quite clearly. I think we had a couple of different examples: early evidence planning, alignment, but also we have heard now a couple of times transparency. Transparency from a market access regulatory perspective, but also transparency when it comes, for example, to the applicability of AI. And AI can be used as well by payers in the near future, maybe as well, for different dynamic pricing options, but also for other areas, such as we have just discussed very briefly how the US FDA, for example, has now introduced their new way of internal processes using and helped by AI. I think quite clearly, and that's very clear and very consistent as well with what we have heard from other discussions in my podcast, was also that experts are still needed and credibility is one of the key parts for the use of AI. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.